Hello everyone, welcome to the sixth video of Figma plugin development. Now this video is a continuation of the previous video where we were trying to break down the APIs and understand them in more detail. Now before we get started, I just want you to make sure that you follow along with me with every step in trying out those APIs, because by the end of this video we have a small teeny tiny assignment aligned for you. So without any further ado, let's get started. Alright, let's continue with the second part of understanding Figma APIs. In the previous video, we had discussed about what are nodes and how do we go about selecting these nodes based on user selection and how can we manipulate those nodes. And also we had discussed about how can we insert these nodes from scratch using the plugin. Now in this video, I want to focus on what are the types of these nodes and how do you go about manipulating the properties specific to the type of the node. Now, before we jump onto the properties, I would like to talk about the types of nodes first. So as you can see in front of your screen, I have a list of all the types of nodes which are supported by Figma plugin. And the list goes on from Boolean operation node, component nodes till vector node. I mean, like, there are multiple nodes here and you don't need to worry about remembering all of them, as Figma documentation has a good support and a list of all the nodes which are supported. And also they have a specific page for each and every node which they support, where you can find all the properties which are supported by these nodes. So let's say you can see all these properties over here, like visible, locked, opacity and whatnot, so related to rectangle node. Similarly, you will find it for ellipse node and all the nodes present in this list over here. Now coming back to the types of nodes over here, so as you know, now that you can refer to the types of nodes on Figma documentation, I also want you to know that you don't have to always work with all the nodes. Whenever you're developing a Figma plugin, you will be mostly dealing with, let's say, 5 to 6 nodes type. Let's say document node, ellipse node, frame node, or even rectangle, text node and line nodes. These are some of the nodes that you will be frequently using, but it's always good to have an idea of all the nodes which are supported by Figma, so that whenever we have to use them in our plugin, in any case, we have a good understanding of from where to refer. So now we can move on to our next topic, which is how to get the type of the node. So let's go back to our VS code, where we can write a simple code of detecting the type of the node. Now what we can do is we can comment down this code from the previous video which we had. We can go and select the section and comment it down. We don't need it anymore. We can also comment this part, as we will be adding a new code in this section. And what we can do is we can change our HTML part as well. We can call it just testing plugin, because we are not dealing with opacities anymore. And we can comment down this button as well, and we can comment down this section as well. Now if you remember, the shortcut to do that is command plus slash. Now that we have commented this, we can rename some of them. So we can call this, let's say, run plugin, and we can change its ID as well. Let's say run plugin, and paste the same ID over here when we are pressing this button. Now whenever we're pressing this button, we should pass a different message. Instead of create rectangle, we can pass, let's say, run plugin, and we can receive this message in our TS file over here. So let's write it down over here. So now we have tweaked our code according to our need. Now we just need to write the code to understand the type of the node which user has selected. So if you remember from the previous video, we had discussed to get to the user selection, we need to use a for loop to capture all the nodes which the user has selected in an array. So we can write it like this: for constant node of Figma dot current page dot selection, and here we can write let's say console.log, which can be node.type. So what we are doing over here is we are simply printing down the type of the node which user has selected, and we are only printing this in our console. So this is a JavaScript function where you can open the console and see and test the way you want the code to run like. So we can save this and we can run our plugin again. Now what I can do is I can actually create a node over here just to test it like a dummy, and now I can run my plugin. Let's say I go over here and click on test plugin FPD. So as you can see, we have this button called run plugin. Now when I click on that, nothing happens over here because it is not expected to do anything on my artboard. It is only printing the type of the node on the console. So what I can do is I can go to plugins again and open the console from over here. When I click on open console, you will see that it has printed the type of the node which is there. Now I can do something similar for a different type of node as well. Let's say I have selected an ellipse and now I run the plugin. Now you can see when I click on run plugin, it will print ellipse. And the same applies for, let's say, vector node as well. When I click this and run the plugin, it will say vector. So this is how it can detect the type of the node which is there, and using this type property, we can manipulate the properties relevant to that particular type of the node. You would have already seen this in the previous video, but I just wanted to make it more clear in this video. So now that we know how to get the type of the node, let's move on to the next section, which is how to manipulate an element. Now that we have an idea of how we can select and understand the node, we should also see how can we manipulate the properties which are supported by that node. Now I prefer breaking this down into a two-step way, where I first try to relate to the requirements with the real Figma interface steps. By that what I mean is I try to perform those actions which I want to automate with the plugin in Figma itself first, and then I try to observe the steps which are required. Now after that, once I know the steps which are required, I try to relate to the properties which I need to manipulate in those steps with the node which needs to be manipulated. Now to give an example, let's say if I had to duplicate an element and change its opacity and position, what I would normally do is I would first try this out in a test environment. Let's say I have a dummy element over here. Now to perform this with the Figma plugin, what I need to do in a first step is I would first of all want to select that element. So let's write it down, get the selected element. Now I want to duplicate it, right? So what I would do is I would select and Command D and duplicate it. So this is how I would duplicate in Figma interface. So now second step is to duplicate the element. Now the third step over here is I cannot see the duplicated element till now. So I want to change the position over here so that I can see it. Now as you can see, I have changed the position in the actual Figma application. Now I need to perform this again with my Figma plugin. So I will write it down, change the position of the element. Now what I can also do is, if you remember, the task here is to change the opacity as well. And to change the opacity in Figma, what I would do is I would select the duplicated element and change its opacity. Let's say I can make this 90 and this will be 90. So what I would write as a fourth step is change the opacity. Now my fifth step is where I would want to duplicate this many times. Let's say I want to make 10 copies of this actual element. So I already have one copy. I can create one more, and let's say I can keep the gap between these elements as, let's say, 150, and I can keep on duplicating this, let's say 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now this is how I would usually perform all these steps in Figma, and I would manually give opacity to this, let's say 80%, 70%, 60%, 50%, 40%, 30%, 20%, and 10%. So this is how I would do this normally inside Figma. So I can write this as a step as well, like duplicate and repeatedly change opacities and position. So this is how I would do this normally in a Figma application, and this is the steps which I can observe that are required to do this. Now what I need to do is, as you would have seen in the previous slide, that I need to understand the properties that these steps or that these node supports. So if I observe this property, like looking at the first step, I can see that I need to get the selected element. So if you remember, this is something we have already done in the previous video, like Figma.currentPage.selection. Now this is how I can get to the selection. Now this is sorted. Now the second one is duplicate the element. Now this is where I need to make use of the Figma documentation. I need to check the Figma documentation and understand how can I duplicate any element. So if I go back to my Figma documentation, let's say I open ellipse node, and I can check that for rectangle node as well, but I can see what is the property which is necessary for me to duplicate it. So I can press Command F and type duplicate. Now this will take me back over here which says clone. Now clone is a function which will help me duplicate that selected element. So I understand over here that I need to make use of this function to duplicate. So what I can do is I can go back and I can write over here that I can use clone as a function to duplicate that element. And this is same applied for rectangle node as well. So if I have to duplicate the rectangle node, there also I can make use of this clone function. So we are going to use this function to duplicate. Now the third thing which I want to do is I also want to change the position of the element. So if I want to go back to Figma documentation, I can go and check what is the option for me to change the position. So let's say I can search for position and I can find the layout related properties over here. So as I can see, I can change the X and Y value directly. So I can write it down over here so that I just need to change the position of node.x or node.y value to just simply update the position of that element. Now the fourth step over here is to change the opacity. So again, I can go back to my Figma docs and search for opacity. Let's say opacity, and you can see that opacity is again a blend related property which can be directly edited, and it must be between 0 and 1. So what I can do is I can go and write node.opacity, which needs to be updated. And the fifth is duplicate and repeatedly change opacities and position. Now this is where I have to make use of a loop which I have to run 10 times and do the functions like, let's say, duplicate, change opacity, and change position. Now we know what are the steps that need to be done in order to complete this task in a pseudocode. Now we need to convert this pseudocode and write it as a TypeScript code that can be converted into a plugin, and that can help us achieve this automatically instead of doing this manually, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So now we are inside our VS Code. So let's go ahead and comment down the previous line of code which we just wrote to get to the node type. We don't need that anymore. And try and understand the steps which are required to create this with a plugin that we want to. So we can actually delete these ellipses for now, and we can only have the dummy one because we need to have this one to create copies of it. So as you can see, the first step over here is to get the selected element. Like we need to get the user selected node over here. So if you remember, we already have it in our VS Code over here, which is constant node of figma.constraint.selection. So we are already getting it in this node array over here. Now the second step which is there is we need to duplicate this element which we are getting by this clone method. Now to do that, what we can do is we can create a new variable called duplicate and take this array which we are getting from the user selection and apply the clone function on top of that, so that we will be duplicating it and storing it in a new variable which is duplicate now. So after that, if you see, the third step over here is to change the position of this new element. So to do that, what we can do is we can write duplicate.x. So right now we are only concerned about changing the position of x-axis and we don't want to change it for y-axis. Now to derive the position of this newly duplicated element, we need to do some math to get to that value. So let's try and understand and do that in our Figma itself. So what I want to do is I want to duplicate the element and I want to place it right next to the previous element, and I want them to have a gap of, let's say, 150 pixels. Now to do that, to start my new duplicate element from this x-axis, which is, let's say, 724 in this case, what I need to do is I need to first of all understand the starting position of this particular selected node. So let's say I need to get this value over here, the starting x-axis. After that, I need to get the width of this node as well. So I need to get this particular width, plus I need to get the gap as well, this gap which is there in between, which is 150 pixel. So let me write that, let me make a rectangle for that as well. So now my new position for this newly duplicated element is the sum of these three values, the sum of the starting x-axis and the width plus the gap that we need to add. So let's go ahead and write that down in the duplicate.x value over here. So if you remember, we need to get the starting value of the selected element that we can get by node.x, plus we need to get the width of that selected element, which we can get by node.width, and plus we need to add the spacing that we want to specify for this newly duplicated element, which is 150 in this case. So we can go ahead and write it over here. Now this will help us duplicate the element and place it right next to the previous selected element. Now the next thing that we want to do is we want to add an opacity to this duplicated element. So if you remember, the step to do that was node.opacity. So what we can do is we can write duplicate dot opacity over here and give it the new value. So this opacity can be, let's say, 0.9. But as you can see, there is an error over here. And if you remember from the previous video, we cannot apply opacity to all the node types. So we need to check if that opacity property is present in this duplicated node which we are creating, and then only we can apply this opacity to this node. So this will help us avoid that error. So now we are duplicating a node and applying it a new opacity. So this is our fourth step. Now, as you can see, the fifth step is to do this repeatedly till we end up creating 10 different nodes, basically copies of this user selected node over here. Now to do that, what we can do is we can actually create a for loop and make it run till the time we end up creating this 10 copies. So we can start this for loop at, let's say, 1, and we can make it end at 9. The reason why we are ending at 9 is because we already have one selected element and we only want to have total of 10 elements. So in order to avoid going till 10 and ending up creating 11 copies, let's only go till 9 so that the total end copies we have is 10. And let's add an increment counter over here, which can be I++, and we can add this code in this for loop. Now let's go ahead and run this for loop, and we can save this and we can run our plugin over here. We can delete all this over here. Now let's select our dummy element and run our plugin. Now when I run this plugin, now you can see that this creates a new element which is right next to the previous element, and you can see that it has created 10 copies of this new element. But there's a problem. It is creating copies on top of the previously duplicated element only. That's why we are not able to see the other remaining elements. Now what we want is, if you remember, we want these copies to be placed right next to each other so that we can see them in a linear order and all the copies are available. So we need to write a logic for that where we can change the position of the duplicated element and make it suit to the for loop which we are creating. So every time a new element is created, it is placed considering the previous elements which are present there. Now to do that, what we need to do is we need to take this node width and write a logic over here which will help us basically place the element next to the previously created element. Now this is a math which we are applying over here, and you can actually take some time and understand the logic over here. So when you save it and when you run the plugin, you will see that it will create the copies of this selected ellipse right next to the previously duplicated element. So every element is placed after the previous element and not on the top of this element. Now this is a basic simple mathematics which I've done over here. So you can actually take some time and understand this. It's just that we're taking the width of the previous width and using this increment counter and multiplying it with the existing width so that we're able to get the cumulative width and we're able to place it right next to the previously duplicated element. And that's how we are able to place the newly created element after next to the previously duplicated element. Now just take some time and understand this logic over here. It's very simple. And now one thing which is still remaining for us to do is we also need to update the opacities on the runtime. We want to have a descending order of opacities where we want the opacity to decrease 90%, 80%, and we want to reach till 10%. Now we can do the same with this opacity over here as well. We can write a logic which will automatically keep on reducing the opacity. So we can do it like this way. We can take 100 as the dummy opacity and we can minus I into 10 so that every time our loop is running, it is always reducing 10% of the opacities in the newly duplicated element. And then we can later divide this whole value by 100, because if you remember, Figma application takes values of opacities from 0 to 1 and we cannot give it in between from 1 to 100. So we need to always have it between 0 to 1. And now when we save this, we will be able to see the results where the opacities are decreasing in order. So let's just save it and run the plugin. Let's go ahead and delete these values for now, and let's select this dummy element and rerun our plugin. Now when I click on run plugin, you can see this opacities are reducing. Now this is 90, this is 80, this is 70, 60, 40, and going towards the end this is 10. Now by this we are able to successfully write a logic to manipulate the properties, duplicate the element, and change the opacity and position by simply observing the steps which are required to be done in an actual Figma application, and we are able to replicate these steps in terms of a Figma plugin code. Now, this is how you can actually manipulate the properties of any element and understanding the type of the element which is there by making use of the Figma documentations. Now that you know how you can manipulate an element, I have a very quick assignment for you. So in this assignment, I want you to change the size of a node and rename its layer by maybe adding the name of the type of the layer. So you can actually pause this video and take some time and try out this example, and post that I can also show you how it can be done. So don't worry, if you're getting stuck, I'll be there to show you how it can be actually done. So please go ahead and pause this video. All right, I'm assuming you were able to do that, but if you had any trouble doing that, let me show you how you can approach that problem. So again, let's go back to our Figma and try and understand this with the basic Figma steps that are required to do that. So let's just delete all these extra ellipses over here and let's just write the steps from scratch. So what we need to do is select the layer, in this case as well, select the layer. The second thing is we need to resize it, right? So we need to change the size of it. Let's say we can call it resize the selected layer. And the third step is we need to also change the name of the layer. So let's say we call it this is ellipse. Now we can do is we can also write rename the layer. Now we need to identify these steps again in terms of Figma APIs and apply these steps in our Figma plugin. So first step is something which we are already aware of. We can make use of Figma.currentPage.selection. Now the second step is to resize the selected layer. So to do that, what we can do is we can go to Figma docs and search for let's say resize, and let's see if there's a method for that. And yes, there's an option to do that as well. So you can use this method called resize, and you can provide the width and height in terms of number, and you can simply resize that. So let's write that down. We can use resize and provide width and height. Now the third step is to rename the layer. So let's go ahead and search for that. And as you can see, there is an option for that as well, which is called as name. So I can simply do this like this. I can write node.name and change the value by that. So let's go to our VS Code and try this out. And we can actually go ahead and just comment down this code. We don't need it anymore. So what we need to do is we need to make use of this current selection which is there, and we need to change its size first of all. So we can use this node.resize function over here, and we can give it a width or height that we want. So let's say I want to go for 400 pixel width and 400 pixels height, and this will simply change the height and width of that particular selected node. Now the second thing which I want to do is I also want to rename the layer over here. So as you can see, I can use node.name equals to any value that I want to give. What we can do is we can actually write a string like this, that this is, and we can write a node type over here. So if it is an ellipse, it will print this is an ellipse, and in case if it's a rectangle, it will print it's a rectangle. So let's save it and see how it comes like. So let's go back to our Figma and run our plugin, and let's see what happens. So as you can see, it's resized to 400 cross 400, and the name of the layer is also changed to this is ellipse. And let's try this over a rectangle as well and see what happens. You can see the same happens with the rectangle. It is changed, and its layer name is also changed to this is rectangle. So yes, this is how you can resize and rename a layer in Figma. And that was the assignment. I hope you were able to change the size of the node and rename its layer. And that was it for this video. And I hope you were able to understand how you can manipulate the layers and how you can try out new properties on different types of nodes. So please go ahead and try them out and make use of Figma documentations to understand each and every node in more details. So that was it for this video, and thanks for watching.